DDR5 memory is here, and with it brings a whole host of exciting changes to PC gaming. While on the face of it, it might look a little bit similar to DDR4, we've now got increased speeds, we've got increased capacities, better thermal management, lower voltages. But unless you're like me and are just a massive nerd, the thing you're probably interested in is whether this actually makes any performance difference to PC gaming. Because if it does, then brilliant, higher frame rates. But if it doesn't, it's just more money that isn't really going to do anything. Which is exactly why in this video, we're going to be answering one simple question. DDR5 memory. Is it worth it for gaming? A massive thank you to Corsair for sponsoring this video. Let's get started. It's just my luck, by the way. I've been waiting ages to actually film this video and for these motherboards to arrive, but you can hear the sound of my voice is pretty sad today. It's not COVID. I'm just generally ill. But don't you worry, that's definitely not going to stop us. And we're going to start by taking a look at the new set of Corsair Vengeance DDR5. It does come in a range of capacities and speeds. This is a 2x16GB kit for a total of 32. This is running at a blisteringly fast 5200 MHz. Do bear in mind though that this is already an overclock speed with the Intel XMP profiles. They're actually baked straight into this set. Corsair also sell their Dominator Platinum in RGB flavors. This does look very similar to the previous generation, but it is my favorite looking RAM because you have this really cool like stack effect, and I've got this in my personal rig. It looks great. But today we are very much focusing on the Vengeance range for a more apples to apples test. We've got a 2x16 running at a blisteringly fast 4600 MHz, which for DDR4 is pretty insane. You're going to need a very high-end motherboard to actually support this, otherwise you're going to run into some issues. Memory overclock fail. And then last, but certainly not least, we have the set of memory that most people would probably be looking at right now for a DDR4 gaming rig. This is Vengeance RGB RT. It's optimized for Ryzen, but crucially it runs at 3600 MHz. And the reason this is relevant is because this is pretty much regarded as the sweet spot at the moment for price to performance when it comes to PC gaming. The thing that you really do need to be aware of though is that you are going to need a specific motherboard to actually support DDR5. And this is one of the reasons it's quite hard to test the performance between these different things, because you need different motherboards. But fortunately, MSI actually do have the perfect solution. They've got their B660M Mortar Wi-Fi, but crucially it comes in two different flavors, one that supports DDR4, one that supports DDR5. Otherwise they are pretty much the same board, or at least as similar as they can be while supporting those two different sets of memory. But the reason that I'm going to show you these two side by side is just to illustrate the fact that these grooves are in slightly different locations. There could be a big technical reason for this, but I would wager that the main reason is so that you don't try and put the wrong RAM in the wrong slots. You can't put 4 in 5 and vice versa. You gotta get into the groove, man. Is that obvious? Or am I just flailing around like an idiot? Again, probably the latter. Just pretend that I'm singing Let's Groove tonight, but obviously I'm not for copyright reasons. So the question is, can you tell the difference between these two boards? They do look exactly the same. You see what I mean? I'm actually still getting confused. This is the DDR4 one. We'll start with our super fast kit of DDR4, and this will just slide in. And then we'll do the same with our DDR5. And at this point you might be thinking, well, obviously DDR5 is going to be better, and if there is any performance difference, clearly DDR5 is going to win. And that is true. I'm definitely not expecting DDR4 to outperform DDR5, but you've got to remember that this is actually quite a bit more of an expensive kit of memory versus DDR4. But if you're planning a gaming PC and you've got to factor in not only the cost of a more expensive motherboard, but then also the cost of more expensive RAM, if it doesn't really make too much of a difference and you're looking at a PC that doesn't like cost you an arm and a leg, it really could be a crucial factor in deciding what to get, because you could spend that extra money and get a better graphics card, and that really would give you a better frame rate. Again, this is the two of them side by side. The DDR5 definitely does look better, but beyond that, yeah. We will start our testing with DDR5, which means DDR4 can go to bed, we can grab our CPU, and we can grab our SSD. This is of course to keep things as fair as possible and to remove as many limiting factors as we can. The CPU we're using is pretty much the best of the best. It's the 12900K, not the KS, because Intel hasn't sent me one of those, and to be honest, no one really should buy it. And I know there are going to be people in the comments saying, why aren't you using Ryzen? Well, the reason for that is because at the time of filming, AMD doesn't actually support DDR5 memory. Obviously it will in the not too distant future, but for now, if you want DDR5, you got to stick with Intel. So both B660, H670, and Z690 actually all support DDR5, but as you can already see, it is on a per board basis because the chipset actually supports both speeds, or both types of memory I should say. So please do make sure that you are doing your due diligence. I hate saying that phrase, I always cock it up. Due diligence. Due diligence. There you go, I can do it now, practice. We are using a super fast PCI Generation 4 SSD. I don't think it's really going to make any difference to the frame rate, as we've tested already. You can find that video in the top right corner of your screen. But obviously the purpose today is to use literally the best of the best components. So we've also got ourselves an RTX 3090 Ti, really pulling out all of the big guns today. Because again, this is about testing the difference memory has on frame rates, not about any other factor. We are of course also going to need a CPU cooler. It is the H100i Elite LCD. I love the fact that with this Corsair cooler, you actually get this little RGB and fan controller with the unit. It makes things a lot easier to organize. That was very quick and very dirty. God, I look a bit like a mad scientist now, don't I, with this? I do believe we're ready now. Always makes you jump. I mean, we've got a CPU light on, which is very strange. Ah, hold on. It's gone white. It's gone white. I mean, it works. It just took quite a long time to initialize. And this is one of the reasons I quite like to get a motherboard that has a little like error code display on it, because you can see that it is progressing and actually doing stuff rather than just relying on 4 lights. So trying that again, we'll go and enable our XMP profile. We can then open up the task manager once again, go over to performance, look at the memory, and there you can see we're running at 5200 megahertz. The way that this is going to work is pretty straightforward. We've got my very crude notepad out again, and we're going to test Call of Duty Warzone, Far Cry 6, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and some Halo Infinite, as this will give us a nice balance between multiplayer titles and the single player ones that will be a lot more scientific. We will begin our testing with arguably the most GPU intensive. This is Far Cry 6, and we're going to run this at max settings with ray tracing. We'll be testing this at a few different resolutions, but otherwise let's set this to Ultra, DXR reflections and shadows on, and then super resolution, we'll set that to quality. And the thing that's quite cool about this is, remember, this is an RTX 3090 Ti with pretty much the best gaming CPU and now some DDR5 memory. So what you're seeing here is pretty much the best of PC gaming right now. And we're getting around about 98 frames a second average. So very much a have your cake and eat it situation. But I mean, spending almost £2,000 on the graphics card alone for a 3090 Ti isn't very realistic. However, with 40 series graphics cards and likely the 7000 series of graphics cards from AMD right around the corner, even though this is a little bit unrealistic now, I think the performance of next gen is going to be huge. So actually, looking ahead, these are the sort of numbers you really should be paying close attention to. But that is Far Cry. Let's move on to some Shadow of the Tomb Raider. We have DLSS set to quality. Once again, this is 4K, and we're set it to highest, which still really annoys me because the highest setting is not the highest setting at all. It's lying again. We're dropping. This is always quite difficult to do because you've got to land in exactly the same area every time. Can't have duff numbers, can we? Unless we were doing a thing for the Simpsons Brewery. Is it copyright to say just keep running, running, keep running, running? Again, that frame rate is pretty impressive. Absolute max settings, DXR ray tracing enabled, 145 frames a second at 4K with DLSS. And then last, but certainly not least, we have some Halo Infinite. Again, we're going to run this at ultra quality, and then we will start moving around, and we will measure our frame rate when we're done. Strangely enough, changing it to 1080p more or less doubles our frame rate. Funny that. So, with all of that out of the way, it leads us on to our second and third tests, which means swapping over motherboards, which is a lot more complicated than literally just swapping out RAM, but, you know, needs must. Fingers crossed, this works without issue. CPU and memory changed. A reminder, by the way, that we are using the super fast DDR4 kit, and this should be a really interesting one because in terms of raw speed, there's not that much difference between the DDR4 and the DDR5, so this is going to let us look at not only a tiny bit extra speed, but then some of the other factors between 4 and 5 and whether that will influence our frame rate. So once again, we go and enable the XMP profile, and just hope that this will run at its proper rated speed, because 4600 megahertz is definitely no joke. Oh, I think we're good. I think we're good. Memory overclock fail. This is disappointing. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to move on to the frankly much more relevant test, the Vengeance RGB running at 3600 MHz. To say that was slightly stressful would definitely be an understatement, as I almost managed to brick the entire motherboard, but fortunately I did manage to get everything working in the end. Other than my voice. That's never been worse. But as you will see from the results, it doesn't really matter that we couldn't get 4600 MHz to work. To explain in more detail, let me hand you over to the one, the only, Benchmarkus. That might actually sound different because I'm filming that bit on Monday.
I guess it almost works a little bit in my favour because the whole joke is that I'm supposed to be a different person, but obviously I'm not. But anyway, having a look at the results, there's not really that much to separate any of them. There are a couple of tests that you do see a slight win for DDR5, and then a couple for DDR4, but are these beyond the margin of error? Not really. Granted, this is only in 4 games, but here's the thing, Warzone is probably the most CPU demanding title that we have at the moment, and this is one of the few tests that you do actually see quite a big difference between, say, 3200 MHz RAM and 3600 MHz. So if you're not seeing anything here with this level of setup with the RTX 3090 Ti, I think it's fairly safe to assume that at the moment, it's not going to have a drastic impact on your frame rate.
I guess the simple fact of the matter is that if you're looking at DDR5 and expecting to get loads extra performance in games, then I think you're going to be disappointed. However, whenever you're buying a full system, you do need to think about longevity, because it wasn't that long ago that I was saying 8 GB of RAM is enough for gaming, and obviously the same can be said for speeds. 3600 MHz versus 32 in something like Warzone does make a significant difference. The game developers aren't going to be developing with DDR5 memory in mind a few years ago because it wasn't a thing, whereas it is now. So in certain PC titles with lower resolutions and a maxed out graphics card, then yes, you probably will start to see a bigger difference between 4 and 5 as time goes on. But the fundamental thing is that if you're purely looking for a gaming PC in terms of value, price to performance, then grabbing yourself a kit of DDR4 memory is going to make financial sense. Just remember that it's pretty much end of the road for DDR4, whereas DDR5 is just getting started. If you are interested in current pricing on both Corsair's DDR4 and DDR5 memory, then you can find this link down below with my Amazon affiliate links. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one. My voice is gone.